What does it mean to be undocumented or to have precarious immigration status in this country?
That's a good question, Steve, and I'm glad you're asking because I think there's a lot of confusion about it in Canada. For our purposes, being undocumented would mean to me that you don't have permanent resident status, you're not a citizen, and you don't have some kind of temporary status allowing you to be in Canada. So perhaps you arrived on a valid visa and that expired. And perhaps precarious immigration status might mean that you have some kind of permit or you're allowed to be in Canada for a particular period of time, for a particular reason, or you're waiting for an application to be processed. But that could change, so there's no security in your situation.
Those watching or listening may have followed this debate in the United States, which gained a great deal of traction recently. People are so-called dreamers. They are the dreamers, named after the DREAM Act. Again, very similar in description. How are undocumented youth in Canada perhaps treated differently from the dreamers in the United States?
Well, I think the easiest answer to that is we don't have a DREAM Act. You know, we don't have a national dialogue about young people who were brought here as children and have no status. We have no specific legislative protections for young people. And, you know, we don't have ways of thinking about them as valid members of society who are worthy of respect and security. So what that means is that because there's no DACA or DREAM Act, they're often locked out of really essential services that every other young person in Canada needs. So it creates a great deal of precarity and insecurity for them.
Akil, I do want to ask you about your personal circumstances, but I know everybody watching or listening is going to want me to first ask, what do you do with the Raptors?
A bunch of different things. I'm fortunate enough to be a sideline reporter for the in-game broadcast. I work sideline with NBA TV, with Raptors 905, as well as host the Raptors daily show and podcast, and a bunch of social media content. And I host Jurassic Park, and I work with the Toronto Maple Leafs hosting Maple Leaf Square, so that's kind of that part of my life.
Okay, my follow-up question is, can we trade jobs?
I don't know. I think you've got a nice gig here. These are important conversations.
I do have a nice gig here, but I want your gig.
Okay, for one day.
That sounds like a ton of fun. You've got personal experience with this.
Yes, I do.
Where are you from originally?
I was born in Trinidad and Tobago, Port of Spain.
Came here at what age?
I came here first at 4, but I think I finally stayed after going back for a little bit around 6 or 7.
And how does all of what we've been talking about here apply to you?
Well, I lived it. It's my lived experience. My parents and my little sister, they emigrated to the United States, and then they sent me and my eldest sister to Toronto because they felt there would be a better opportunity for us. Our visas expired, and I ended up spending 20-odd years living in Toronto as an undocumented person without the ability to work or drive a car or attend post-secondary school, go see a doctor. So I've lived this experience and had to negotiate and find ways to hide and at the same time get my education and put myself in a position to have, the job that I love so much today.
For 20 years you did that?
Yes.
Now, when you say you were undocumented, no passport, no birth certificate, what'd you have?
So I had a passport that had expired, and that was about it. Came here on a visitor's visa, I believe. I've never actually seen the visitor's visa. I was separated from my parents. There was no communication. And so I had left the responsibility to all of the paperwork to other family members who weren't as actively pursuing my status. And so at around the age of, I think, maybe 15 or 14, when my friends started to get part-time jobs, I became super curious as to why I couldn't get a part-time job or why I wasn't going to the doctor or the dentist. And slowly the information came to trickle out that I was, at the time, they called us illegal aliens. And that's what I found out. And thankful to the people over at FCJ, I was fortunate enough to have a best friend whose parents helped start that program, and they helped me a lot.
Could you get a driver's license?
I could not.
So what did you do for 20 years if you couldn't work, couldn't go to post-secondary? What'd you do?
I would love to be able to say everything that I did, but I think for a lot of people who are undocumented, you had to do things to survive, and you're put in a very vulnerable position. So you have to be very careful about what you share and what you tell. And even once you do get your papers, some of the things that you do have to, stay in the dark because there aren't a lot of protections, and you have to look out for yourself.
I can't let that alone, right? I've got to follow up on that.
Follow up, go ahead.
Can you give us a hint? Give us a hint about what you had to do.
Well, first off, there's a lot of opportunities as a young person to work under the table. So you take jobs that you can do. I was a mover. I was a bar back at nightclubs. I did things like that. And then talk about getting an education. I was very fortunate to, slip through the cracks when it came to college. They didn't ask for my social insurance number. And then when they finally came around to asking, I had to drop out and then wait for a certain amount of time to pass. So I think it took me 4.5 years to finish a 2-year program at Seneca College. But, that was even a blessing in disguise because it allowed me to mature a little bit more. But there's a lot of hiccups, a lot of hurdles, a lot of secrets that you have to have if you're an undocumented person trying to make your way.
Amazing. Akil has basically explained his life story here, and it's absolutely fascinating. And we're thrilled that you're here today, and we're grateful for you sharing your story. I wonder, and he referenced FCJ in the middle of that, and that's where you spend your time. And I wonder how much you think the public knows about this kind of experience, which is sort of happening in plain sight, but not really in our midst. What do you think?
I think with the folks that we work with, I want to say, firstly, it's like a privilege being able to work with folks who are here with precarious status, because you get to learn and understand the intricacies and the hardships people have to go through because of issues with the system itself. Playing off on some of my own story, too, in this circumstance of how I got connected to FCJ in the first place, I, too, had a journey of precarious status. I came here as a visitor for a family funeral, then the pandemic hit, so we didn't get to go back before applying to study here. And then I followed every step the government had set out, but they made a mistake in every single application I had. So I had to manage my immigration status, go to school, finish it, graduate with honors in a community worker program, then get into a community setting where they made an issue again with my work permit. So I was left for 6 months without working status. So how do I navigate that precarious status while being an international student? Fortunately, I had family to back me up, but that's not the case for a lot of people. And oftentimes, I think the perspective is that folks come here on a visitor status and want to overstay and have some benefit from this country, but that's not always the circumstances. Had I not had that backing up of family, I would be here undocumented and not know how to figure things out.
So what'd you do for 6 months?
I had to just stay with family, volunteer, give back to the community. FCJ gave me that opportunity to volunteer, stay engaged. And as soon as I had my permit, I became the Youth and Access to Education Coordinator. So that experience working directly with community benefited me in terms of learning the precarities of my own status, how to defend myself, and then use that voice and experience that I gained to advocate for others in similar circumstances that might not have access to that information that I did.
Just take 20 seconds, Nick, because FCJ is a group that we've had members of on this program many times, and they do tremendous work. Tell us about what you do.
So I'm the Youth and Access to Education Coordinator. I work closely with the youth program that we have at the center that's been in functioning for over a decade now. And it is boasted on the fact that we welcome anyone who's a newcomer youth, regardless of their immigration status, and all of their needs. We're able to identify and work with them to empower them to have the knowledge of how to navigate that process themselves. We're giving them the tools, we're putting the power in their hands to speak and bring their own voice to the forefront of the conversation.
Gotcha. Arlo, your connection to this issue is what?
So I've been researching through Sarah's organization, actually, student experiences of being precarious in the secondary classroom in secondary schools. And so that's been research developed with students with precarious status, trying to ask questions that can only be even formulated based on a deep understanding of what students are going through and how schooling feels, looks, and sort of acts for them.
Do you know in your classes who's documented and who's not?
So most teachers will not know. And in fact, to go even further and sort of span out a bit, most teachers won't know that there may even be people with precarious status in their schools. More broadly, this isn't a professional development conversation. It's rarely a union conversation. So it's a relatively unknown, yet hugely important piece of information for teachers.
We've heard a couple of examples here about how young people try to fly under the radar when they are undocumented. What would you add to that based on your research?
Well, I mean, Akil mentioned the secrets that get kept. And when we look at students' experiences, not only do we see a lot of secret keeping and as you say, sort of flying under the radar, but I think about it as strategic hiding. So students who are having to keep secrets in order to keep themselves safe. And those secrets have real impacts not only on student well-being, but also academic engagement. So we see students, for instance, trying to avoid the honor roll because they don't want their name up in the hallway. We see students, if we think about extracurriculars, not only wanting to avoid a field trip for, say, a track meet, even though they might know that they're a very fast runner, but also just not wanting to be known as someone who's excellent because that makes you stand out. So there's these ways that people disengage. And then even further, I research race and education, and when we get into questions around, do you feel comfortable speaking up around social justice? If you hear something racist said in the classroom, do you feel like you can step in? If you hear a micro or macro aggression about immigrants or about undocumented people, do you feel you can say something? And we feel students have to, again, keep those secrets in a way that they feel is required to be safe in those classrooms. So the self-actualization, what it looks like to be fully and fulsomely included for students, that pathway is just another blocked pathway for a lot of kids.
If what you learned about this subject, for example, you learned by watching Fox News in the United States, you might assume that a lot of these kids who are flying under the radar are committing crimes, mayhem, not contributing to their communities, bad actors, et cetera, et cetera. How much of that's going on in fact versus the reality?
I don't think there's any good data to suggest that that's going on at any rate higher in that population than any other population. And I'd go further to say that these are folks who have all of the best reasons in the world to avoid police, to avoid conversations where ID might be produced. So I think if there's any group you can count on to be wanting to fly under the police radar, it's these folks. And having said all of that, there is a danger of going into a conversation where we say, well, these are good people. And I would suggest whether or not a student is a good person, that's not really a question we ask about whether a student belongs at a high school. There's really mediocre students who are supposed to belong. There's bad people, they're still supposed to belong. So even the narrative around are these good people, that we can't get stuck on that for too long. But I think statistically, data-wise, there's nothing to suggest that these folks are involved in anything negative, I would say.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.